Hello, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report for August the 1st, 2012. I'm John Hofel, and joining me today are Cody Jones and Jason Ross of The Basement and Lyndon LaRouche.
Good morning, Lynn. John.
Good morning.
Well, there's an interesting question. The question is, what is progress? What is scientific progress? What we know, in fact, is from history is that the scientific progress is dominated by change in the criterion of what we call energy, or the equivalent, the mode of man's power in the universe. And we're looking for those kinds of changes in mode which are not just gradual, but are leaps in terms of our reference. We go from one form of energy flux density to a higher form. And it's through this progress, which only man can do, of all known species to us so far, which defines human beings and defines what is the freedom of human beings from slavery to a fixed system. And since the end of the 19th century and the entry through World War I, so-called, and into the 1920s, mankind has been undergoing a rapid degeneration in morality and in science. The Bertrand Russell role in the 1920s is exemplary of this process with a certain degree of ferocity about the whole business. So our job is to look for the things which are permanent in the process of mankind's progress, and to recognize that there is an implicit principle of permanence, which defines permanent progress, as opposed to permanent exhaustion. And that's what our principle is. We know we can do this because we know that sense perception is actually a function of the technology which we are using now. We adapt what we know as the principles of nature. We call these the things that we sense. And we use sense perception as a variable, not a fixed thing. It's a convenience from it's man's use. Man goes to the toilet and does things like that. These things are necessary, and they bring about change. So the question is, what is the principle of change? Looking at the history of mankind in terms of physical science, in terms of the evolution of culture, the evolution of languages, what is this process of evolution? And what is it as different from ordinary sense perception? What is outside sense perception? How can we say that mere sense perception is a standard? It is not a standard. It changes every time mankind makes a discovery. And therefore we want the discovery of the discovery. We want the process of discovery, which is the process of discovery. And we have the ability to do that. All we have to do is admit that things have been, so we say, screwed up, particularly in the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And we have to get back to the level that was posed by people like Planck, like Riemann before him, and Einstein. And that gives you a sense of where we are. And mankind desperately needs that. I saw the leading press today from India, the reports from India. And you see how India is, in a sense, a great country in one respect, but with a cultural factor in its culture, which causes it to lose. The caste system, the relics of the caste system still exist. And we see a great nation crippling itself by failing to recognize the need to pull up all of mankind to a higher level, which many parts of the world have not yet done. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's our job morally as well as scientifically to look at the factor of change which moves mankind to base itself on higher orders of principle than those used before, recognizing that physical principles are the first standard that you use. The changes and improvements in physical principle are the first thing you must look at and find the changes so defined and use those as a barometer of how we must plan our future and plan the policies of nations. Now, everyone knows now that if there's an attempt to go to a war in Eurasia around this question, it's going to be a thermonuclear war, from which possibly the human species could not survive. The likelihood that we would not survive if an actual thermonuclear war were launched is great. It doesn't mean they have to kill everybody at once to do that. It means that the after effects of having launched the kind of nuclear assault, which is a global nuclear war, a thermonuclear war, would create conditions on the planet, weather conditions, and similar kinds of conditions from which it's likely mankind as a species would not survive. And yet we have absolute madmen who are doing that, who are pushing for that kind of warfare. The President of the United States is an instrument in pushing for that kind of warfare, the extinction of the human species. Now you say, what is this? What's wrong with these guys? Don't they know that? Yes, they do. But there is a group in the world, of the oligarchical principle group, which say that they would rather see the human species go extinct than that their oligarchical system be ceased on this planet. That's only one example. The point is the universe always changes. It changes. It has always changed. Mankind has been an agent of change, or a catalytic agent of potential change, beyond anything before. Because we are a voluntary species. Other species are not voluntary. They're reactive species. They react to the conditions in which they find themselves. They evolve to fit the conditions in which they find themselves. When they reach that limits of that, well, generally some change comes along, a biological change, and they disappear and something else replaces them. Mm-hmm. Mankind is the only creature which, on number one, is creative, voluntarily. It's the only one that has the ability to be creative voluntarily. And therefore, our problem, therefore, is to recognize what we are, that we do not go on habits. We do not have fixed habits. We are always using creativity, which is our nature. We're changing the universe. And these changes are all come down to one thing as their principle: the increase of energy, flux, density in the universe.
Mm-hmm. And that becomes precisely the way that the idea of value now has to be determined. That the value of things today, the value of activity today, has to be determined from the standpoint of moving towards that higher energy flux density platform towards Mars. And that's what's wholly lacking. I mean, for example, even in terms of energy, as energy is discussed, our energy policy in the United States, right? People make a big deal about the fact that, for example, now in Pennsylvania, my home state, they found all this natural gas and whatnot in the shale. So they're saying this is a big boom for the state. We're now able to extract natural gas and everybody's getting rich, and that's thought of as value, as wealth. Or up in Canada, they're talking about the oil sands. Oh, if we can extract that oil, that's going to be wealth. That's going to make people rich. We can finally free ourselves from the Middle East oil. But it's still stuck within the idea that value is consuming relative to the current system. That, well, we've increased our ability to consume relative to our current fixed system. And that's how values are placed, more or less. As opposed to, no, we're going to place value, we're going to value things based on how does that contribute towards getting us to this next platform? What's the relative value towards that new future state that we're trying to achieve? When you do that, it completely redefines all your ideas of money, valuation, credit, economy. And until we really start to operate from that standpoint, we're always going to find ourselves in these kinds of crises and these monetarist crises.
When you think about these kinds of missions, you add one thing to them. Look at the history of mankind. How many persons inside various societies have actually led and made possible the progress of humanity? They're very few. Mm-hmm. You can go through the names of leading scientists in modern European history, for example. How few there were who actually made the discoveries. Then you had a secondary layer of people who were inspired by the leading types of persons, and you spread something from there. You then create institutions of education. You spread byproducts of this process into the educational system to the extent that you do. So therefore, it's a very small ration of the total population that is actually has historically brought man forward when man has gone forward. Mm-hmm. And it's essential that the voice of those very few be understood and used. When we find that actually happens in history, all successes in the progress of mankind have come from a very few people who've inspired the discoveries which made these things possible. And all political leadership in nations is similarly a tiny, tiny minority of the population of all nations and cultures in the world is actually responsible for the initiative which results in progress for mankind. Our job is to continue that progress, to accelerate it, and to spread it, to bring greater rations of the total population into that process of creativity. Whereas now we have a very precious, very tiny part of the population, even those called scientists, who you would even want in the toilet. That's how bad it is. And our primary job is to get the picture of this and present the picture of this, to present what is possible and make sure it is possible, our responsibility. But to push it, we have to push the Mars project. We have to always go ahead of what the immediate thing is that people are saying do. You've got to look not at the next option. You've got to look at the options beyond that. You've got to think about what people should be thinking a generation from now. And you look back at, for example, the case of Max Planck and Einstein and so forth, and you see model minds. Riemann is the same thing. Model minds at various points whose effective influence, has laid the foundation for leaps of mankind into new possibilities of achievement. And that's what we have to think of. We have to think about the education of the very few who still in the populations actually provide actual leadership toward progress, toward leaps, toward, say, our based operations on Mars, which we're using to defend Earth from Mars. And that's what we've got to get. We've got to get more people. We've got to take people who will think that way, encourage them to think that way, to act that way.
Right.
And that's the great challenge before us.